All right. Hi, it's Mrs. Sloan, and we're going to continue on with APBio Chapter 1. And we're towards the end of the chapter where we're going to look at the science practices. And I will introduce you to chi-square test, and we'll have some further practice on that later as well. So here we go. Let me get in presentation mode. All right, there we go. So the first thing here is you can just look at the list of science practices. And remember I was grabbing some stuff. The notes for this presentation are in the link below. They're also in the first video link, as well as this Google slide presentation I'm giving to you now. So on your science practices, you're going to have the opportunity to use these throughout the entire year. These are very similar to the next generation science standards, the science practices there as well. All right, so the first one is about communicating with models. So just real briefly, I want to give you an example of a model. When we start talking about the cell cycle and the steps that it goes through, I will probably use a model representation to explain it to you. And I will say, hey, what happens when you go to an airport? How do you get on an airplane? What has to happen for you able to get on that airplane if you arrive at, let's say, LAX? Well, to even get in the door, you have to have a what? A ticket, right? So you have to have a ticket to ride, and then you have to pass through security, right? So there's two checkpoints there. You have to have the ticket and you have to pass through security. In the cell cycle, it works the same way. Before you move on to the next step of the cell cycle, you could have a broken cell, a cancerous cell. So first of all, you have to have the cellular signals like cyclins that say, yes, go on to the next step, and you have to pass security. The cell needs to get analyzed to make sure the DNA is either lined up properly or it has been replicated properly. So that's an example of using a model, right, to explain a concept so you could better understand it. All right, there's lots of different ways to do models. We'll put a pin in that for now. The second science practice is using mathematics appropriately. And we will typically use those mathematics in order to analyze data. So I'm sure you're familiar with claim, evidence, reason. So I could make a claim. I need to support it with evidence and then give a reason. Sometimes we have the evidence, sometimes we only have the reason. But analyzing evidence requires math and it requires statistics. So we'll look at that a little bit more today. The third science practice is a student can engage in scientific questioning to extend thinking or to guide investigations within the context of the APBio course. So you are asking a question that can be answered with data, right? In our lab investigations that we do. Does sunlight affect how well a plant grows? That could be a scientific question. And then you would have to gather data in order to answer that question. Science practice number 4, a student can plan and implement data collection strategies. We will spend time with that even though we are in remote learning, and I will help guide you through the steps of a scientific process. We always start with a driving question, and we might do some research to find out a little bit more about that topic, and we will propose a hypothesis and possibly a prediction, an if then because, and then we will gather data and analyze that data and come up with some conclusions and maybe look at some errors. So that's part of science practice 4. So science practice 5 is actually doing the data analysis and evaluation of evidence. And 6, you can work with scientific explanations and theories. For instance, you could work with osmosis and you could talk to me why if you took some carrots that you just peeled and put them in salt water, you could explain to me why those carrots would wilt in salt water, but if you put them in distilled water, those carrots would not wilt. And so you can explain that. And then the last science practice is you're able to connect. So you're going to want to connect between the 4 big ideas, but always when you're doing your science, you want to connect with the different core. Like you've had a little bit of physics at this point because you had an introduction to it in Foundations of Science class. You've already had a little bit of chemistry. You've had some earth science. So we want to use all the information we know from all those courses. Okay, so that's an introduction to the science practices. As far as your notes go, let me help you with your notes, okay? So on number 1, it's communicating with models. Number 2, you need the word math, using math appropriately. Number 3, questioning scientifically. Number 4, collecting data responsibly. Number 5, analyzing and evaluating data. Number 6, justifying conclusions and theories. Evidence to support a claim. Evidence to support a claim. And then number 7, expanding understanding and connections. All right? Okay, so moving on. The scientific method as an ongoing process, you can see what we just talked about right here in this diagram, right? Start with making your observations, thinking of some interesting questions, formulate a hypothesis, have some predictions, if then because, if I do this, then this will happen. And then you gather your data. And once you have your data, you are not done, right? You're going to maybe need to do some more experimentation, maybe change your predictions and try again. So there's that cycle that goes around and around. And then it could lead to a theory, several different experiments repeated multiple times. Then you might have a theory, something that joins together some concepts. All right, so on your notes, the process of science. The scientific method acts as a guideline for scientific studies. So you have number 1, observation, formal way of seeing what happens. Number 2, a hypothesis. You can use, and I believe I have a slide for this. Yes, I do. To formulate your hypothesis, you're going to use inductive reasoning from a number of different observations. So you might do a little bit of research, right? And then you're going to draw eventually a general conclusion from that. So you can read the observations here. And then the general conclusion that was drawn is that individuals most adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and pass their traits to the next generation. So that's a conclusion. That's a statement. You use that to formulate your hypothesis. But to make predictions from that, like an if then because, you use deductive reasoning from this general premise that we have, and you're predicting what the results will be. So if you look at the predicted results right here with the deductive reasoning, if the average temperature, since I already understand this over here, right? If the average temperature in an ecosystem increases due to climate change, individuals better adapted to warmer temperatures will outcompete those that are not. And then I could collect data on that. So on your notes, the hypothesis, using inductive reasoning to formulate a possible explanation for a natural event. To formulate a possible explanation for a natural event. Predictions and experiments, you have deductive reasoning, you have experimental design, and then on your notes, we're going to talk about independent and dependent variables. So independent variables are what you choose. Dependent variable is the data. I'll show you a slide on that. But for now, for your notes, your experimental variable or your independent variable is what is being tested. And your responding or dependent variable are your results or your data. So your control, you want to have a controlled experiment, hopefully, is not exposed to that particular variable. All right. And then next, let me get you here. You're going to want to present your data in some sort of graph, and you will do your analysis, and you have all of that there on your notes as well as scientific theory, okay? And it talks about statistical significance in your notes. So let me just walk you through that, okay? So how do you know if you've written this hypothesis and now you have your numbers? How do you know if your data supports your hypothesis or doesn't support your hypothesis? When are the numbers becoming significant? How do you know whether to accept or reject your hypothesis? And what types of hypotheses are there? So let's take a look at that. And again, quick review here between an independent variable and a dependent variable. Remember, an independent variable is what you're testing. So that's your input. And then your output is your data that you have. So what we're trying to find out is this data, this dependent variable, does it support or not support our hypothesis? So now we need to transition to what types of hypotheses are there. All right, so here's your next slide. I know this is a wall of words, okay? Don't stress out. So there's two general hypotheses. A research hypothesis is what's called an H1. It's saying that there is a connection between A and B. For instance, if you exercise regularly and you run, then there's probably going to be a connection to your heart rate. It's probably going to speed up when you are exercising, and when you're resting, it's probably going to beat more slowly. A is connected to B. Okay, a research hypothesis, I'm looking to support how A is connected to B. All right, a null hypothesis, that's H0. There's no connection. It's all chance. That's what you're saying. And that A has no impact on B. So that exercising is not going to contribute to your cardiovascular endurance. There's no connection there. And I know you might ask yourself, like, why are we having this discussion? And let me explain it. Sometimes it's really hard to make the connection between A and B because there's so many other variables that can contribute to your, let's say, cardiovascular endurance. Maybe it's the type of foods that you're eating. Maybe there's some genetics that are involved. Maybe you're not running very hard. So there could be so many different variables to look at, to consider. So a null hypothesis, even though you know probably if you exercise right, you're going to have better health, but a null hypothesis, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure in your experiment. You're saying there's no connection whatsoever. And people are like, what? And you're saying, no, there's no connection. And then you see if the data fails to support that hypothesis. And if you fail to support your null, then it's the other side of the coin. You're supporting then the alternative hypothesis, which is there is some connection. Okay, by saying that there's no connection and getting data that overwhelmingly disproves that hypothesis, then you support the alternative hypothesis. It's two sides to the same coin, right? I'm either saying, yes, there is a connection, or no, there isn't a connection, right? And then we look at the data to see how it works. Let me give you an example. It'll help you a lot better. Okay. So, and you're like, I already got it, Miss Sloan. I don't need any more help. Okay. So going back to that earlier graphic, okay, if you're doing a research hypothesis, then you're saying that the independent variable is connected to the dependent variable. The more I work out, let's say, the lower my resting heart rate will be. If you're using a null hypothesis, then you're saying there is no connection between how much I work out and what my resting heart rate is. So let's look at an example. Okay. Let's say somebody said, this is their question, is there a connection between the amount of sleep you get and your grades? So intuitively, I bet you would say over time, right? If you got 2 hours of sleep a night, probably it would impact your grades because you're tired and you're falling asleep during your exam, like this person right here, right? But if you're going to write a research hypothesis, it's very specific. So you're saying if a student gets at least 7 hours of sleep a night, then they will earn higher grades. Well, getting 7 hours of sleep a night does not ensure that you will have higher grades. First of all, you may not understand the material very well. You may not have a great teacher. You may have a lot of other homework that night. So it doesn't ensure just if you sleep 7 hours that you will earn higher grades. So maybe a better way to go about your experiment is to say there's no connection between sleep and grades. Then if the data shows that trending that people who had more sleep had higher grades, then, and it's over, and we'll look at how we would analyze that data, then that can say, you know what, we cannot support that there's no connection. There must be a connection. So in turn, it supports the idea that more sleep, better grades. All right. It's one of many variables that would contribute to better grades. All right. So now chance. Chance is always a part of any experiment, right? If I flip a coin and I flip this coin 10 times, how many times would you expect it to be heads and how many times would you expect it to be tails? Well, since it can either be heads or tails, you'd expect 50-50 chance, right? So I'd expect 5 of the times it would be heads and 5 of the times it would be tails. Well, what happens if I get 6 and 4? Now, is that due to chance or is there something wrong with my coin? All right, so chance is always a part. How much chance do we allow? A null hypothesis says it is due to chance alone if you see any connection. And that's when we need to look at the data and say, you know what? The chances of this happening are pretty slim. So no, there is a connection. A research hypothesis says that two are linked. Those variables are linked. When you disprove a null, you'll support the research. Okay, I've talked at you. Let's look at an example. Okay, if I were to deal out 20 cards from a deck that I told you that I had shuffled and was a real deck and I hadn't messed with it, if I were to deal out 20 cards from a deck, how many cards do you think I would expect to get that are red versus black? And you would probably tell me, well, 20 cards, all the cards are either red or black, so 10 would be red and 10 would be black. But if I got 8 cards that were red and 12 cards that were black, is there something wrong with my deck of cards? So let's analyze that. So if I observed 8 red, 12 black, I need to know how far off am I? So I would then fill out what I expected. So I expected 10 for both red and black. What is the difference between that? Just do the math. 8 minus 10 is minus 2. That would be what you'd put in the difference. And 12 minus 10 is plus 2. So now I know how far I'm off from what I expected. So the next step is when you analyze this data, and I'm showing you a shortcut to the chi-square test, but I'll show you the whole equation in just a minute. The difference between that, you take how far off from what you predicted and you square that difference. So 2 times 2, negative 2 times negative 2 is 4. And I put that over what I expected. I expected 10. So 4 over 10 would be 0.4, right? And then 4 over 10, I put those two differences that I squared over what I expected and I add them together. So I end up with 0.8. What's 0.8? Okay, so it's just your difference squared over what you expected, all summed together, all added together. Well, what I can do with that number, and hopefully you see what we did up here, observe minus expected squared over expected, okay? This number that you just calculated is called the chi-square number. Don't square root it, it's just called the chi-square number. So your chi-squared value is 0.8. Now you look at a table to decide, is that number, that deviation from what I expected squared, divided by what I expected added together, is that an okay number? Can that be due to chance? Well, you have tables to help you with that. Now, if there's only a 5% chance that you would get 0.8 or less, then there's something up with your deck of cards. So let me show you here. Okay, when we look at this probability table, the first thing you're going to see here is your degrees of freedom over here on the left. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by degrees of freedom. It is always how many choices you have. We have red and black minus 1. Okay, so my degrees of freedom is 1. If I had 4 choices, if instead of red and black, I was looking at the 4 suits of cards and I was looking at the numbers I got of each suit, since I have 4 choices minus 1, then my degrees of freedom would be 3. Right? Okay, so For instance, if you think about it like this, if I said, hey, there's 2 chairs sitting in my room right here, which one do you want, right? Then there's only 1 degree of freedom, because if it's not this, it's that, if that helps you. Okay, so we had 2 choices. 2 minus 1 is 1, so degrees of freedom is 1. And I go over on this table. Now, if my chi-squared value was very, very small, that means my deviation from what I expected was very, very small. And so I'm good with that, and it would support my hypothesis. If my chi-squared value is very large, then I am probably going to say chance would have no part in that. Now, look at this right here. 3.84 is your magic number right there. If it is 3.84 or greater, right, then that means the percent chance of you ever getting that data is pretty low, 5% chance or less, so we would have to reject it. Well, we had 1 degree of freedom, and our number was 0.8. So where would 0.8 fall between? It would fall between 50% and 25% of the time. If it's in there, if it's one of those numbers, I can accept the null hypothesis. There's nothing wrong with my deck of cards, and I'm good. Okay, let me show you. This is a bigger probability table showing you up to 10 degrees of freedom. It still is the same, right? We would have fallen somewhere between 50 and 30% with 3 degrees, with 1 degree of freedom. So we are fine. As the numbers across here, you can notice they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That means, remember when we did the math, we took the difference squared over what we expected and added those all together. If you are off by a lot, you are going to get a big chi-square number. And if you have a large chi-square number, then you are going to reject your null hypothesis. All right. Let's look at the actual equation that we used. All right. It looks easier once you've done it once, I think. So this right here says chi-squared. This right here just means sum. So we took the observed minus what we expected squared over our expected, and for each thing that we expected. So we had 2 decks of cards, right? So we did 8 minus 10, right, is 2 squared over what we expected, 10, and that was one of our values. Then we did the 12 minus 10, right? And we just added all of those up to get our chi-squared value. All right, and let's just do another one. And so in this case, and we're doing this with your null hypothesis, saying there's no problem here, there's no connection. It's saying right now 35.2% of chemists are women. A null hypothesis would say to you, there's no connection between, in a binary world of male-female, between women and the field of chemistry. Women are not underrepresented in the field of chemistry. Okay. Now let's talk about this. Again, binary world, 100% either male or female. Then you would expect, if it didn't matter what sex you were for the job that you picked, then you would expect 50%, right? 50% to be female and 50% to be male. So we only have 35.2%. Is that statistically significant? Do we need to throw out this null hypothesis? Pause, if you will, and try to do the math on your own. If not, if you don't pause, I'm just going to go on and show you how it would be solved. Okay, this is just me sketching really quick. Okay, so female, I observed 35.2. Male, then by default, minus from 100, right, would be 64.8. I expected 50 and 50. Do not, when you do percents, don't do decimal. Don't do 0.35. It will not work, okay? You got to use, no decimals. So when I take, now the next step, again, you can pause if you needed a little help. Take the difference between what I observed and what I expected. Take that difference, and then do you remember what the next step is? Take the difference and square it and put it over what you expected. So pause if you want to. Okay, so this would be the chart that you're looking at next, right? Observed, expected, take your difference, square it, right? And then you're going to put that, the difference squared over what you expect. So if you work this out, okay, and I did, all right, the difference, and then you square it. And remember, negative numbers become positive when you multiply them together. And then I took 219 over what I expected, 50, and I got 4.4. So then I would add those up, and that would be 8.8. Is that going to be statistically significant? I put DF here, that's degrees of freedom, because if you weren't female, you were male. So you had two choices, -1. That means I have 1 degree of freedom, and my number is 8.8. So if I look here, 1 degree of freedom, I'm looking for where 8.8, boom, I'm already in the rejection zone. This is 5%, this is 1%. Having that would happen less than 1% of the time. So remember, my null hypothesis says that what sex you are doesn't have any influence on what job you take. Well, that you would only have 35% of them be women. Yeah, that is, there's something else at play that is larger than chance. And so that is influencing job choice. All right, so this is an example of how you use math to analyze data. And these are very simple because we only had 2 choices, and we'll have some more time to work with chi-square, but I did want to introduce it to you. All right, so here's a quick review of the scientific method. So keep in mind, when you get your results, if your evidence supports your hypothesis, great. But if it does not, if it's inconsistent with your hypothesis, which ours just was, then you probably need to revise your hypothesis and say that the sex that you are does influence what job that you take. All right? And I think the last thing here are theories. I've given you all the notes for that. So here are some, there's the cell theory, that all living cells all living organisms are made of cells. We've talked about that a little bit, and here are some other ones as well. So I know that was a lot of math. I'm going to give you some time to practice, but that's it.